right, straight back down to business with a panel discussion that looks, well, at a pretty fundamental question, really, whether zero tailpipe emission vehicles are actually the best answer to decarbonisation. And I should say, before we get to our next panel as well, I should remind you that if you have a question for anyone, if you want to take the discussion in one area or another, you can get it through to me on this fantastic machine that I've got here in front of me. So before we go into the details, let's have a few introductory thoughts from our panellists.
In my view, for net zero, we need to be more focused on life cycle analysis and sustainability.
Cooperation and partnerships are more crucial than ever. BYD believes that cooperation can bring greater benefits, not only for the manufacturers, but more importantly, for the customers, the market they serve, and the public at large.
Transition to low-carbon transport introduces changes in technology that have direct implications in the material requirements.
We're really confident that electricity supply is going to be zero carbon. In fact, it's a bit of the economy that has decarbonised faster than anything else.
There is no one-size-fits-all solution to zero carbon transport, but the dominant technology is likely to be electrification in its various forms.
Using electrical energy and battery electric vehicles are really the best long-term options for public transport operators. Battery-powered electric vehicle technology is delivering tangible, sustainable benefits today.
We produce close to 3 billion tonnes of iron ore, and lithium production is just over 100,000 tonnes per annum.
The lines are blurring all the time between energy and the automotive sectors. Your car isn't just going to be a form of mobility, but a tiny portable battery that we might use to balance the rest of the grid.
We've got a lot to do in the 10 years to 2030. For the UK, I think that means infrastructure, it means battery manufacture, and it means skills.
So we join all of our panellists live now. Let's start with that central question. Are we convinced? How convinced are we that zero emission vehicles are the answer? Let's kick off with you, Neville. What's your answer to that question?
Sorry, come off mute there. So I think electrification is going to be the dominant form of propulsion in the future. The real question is it feasible for all vehicles and all applications to go in that direction? So another thing to bear in mind with zero emissions is, at the moment, we're just looking at in use. Ultimately, we have to look at life cycle, total environmental impact, and sustainability. And sustainability is not just about environmental factors, it's also about the economics and the social acceptability. So I think we have a lot to do in order to get to net zero emissions. And to do that, we have to focus on far more than just tailpipe emissions. Zero emissions, as they're called for vehicles, were originally proposed for air quality, not for greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, which is a really interesting point. Do you agree, Lady Brown, that there's a job of work still to be done to convince everyone that this is the way to go, but it is fundamentally, at the end stage, the way to go?
As ever, to get to net zero in the UK, we really do have to get our transport emissions down pretty much to zero. Of course, from the point of view of land transport, the best thing would be if, of course, we all used public transport and went for walking and cycling. But, of course, the Citizens' Assembly has told us that whilst people will do some more of that, that's not how people see the future. People really value the independence that their cars gives them. So getting cars down to zero tailpipe emissions, and remembering, as Emma said to us in the introduction, that we are rapidly decarbonising our electricity system. So by 2030, we'll be down to about 45 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. By 2035, we're down to about 10. By 2050, we should be able to be down to 2 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So the electricity being used both to make our cars and to drive them will be pretty much zero emissions.
Yeah. Neville mentioned heavier vehicles there. Isbrand, if I can turn to you, do you believe that battery technology is still the right technology for heavy-duty vehicles like buses, the obvious example? Are there, do you think, potential realistic alternatives? No, we seem to have...
Are we on mute?
Yeah, you're on mute. We're all on mute. Well, it's the proper way to begin one of these discussions is on mute. And then also not only to be on mute, but to realise that you're on mute, which you've all brilliantly done. So I think we can hear you now.
All righty. Let's try again. Good question about heavy-duty vehicles, whether electrification is the right solution. I believe it is. I believe that right now, if you look at London, Nottinghamshire, you see a lot of electric buses in operation. And we're very proud to be one of the contributors to these electric vehicles right now on the road. And they're saving tons of carbon emission. Zero tailpipe emission is the key. Now, going back to the question about heavy-duty vehicles, I do believe the last mile solution can be the first revolution of many, many more revolutions to come in this transformation. Surely but slowly, it's going to happen. And I think that we're working on solutions right now with a lot of operators today. And we're also working with a lot of companies that are delivering the last mile solution. So long question short, yes, I think it is a solution.
Right. So if it is a solution, if we're focusing on battery technology, EVI, what are the raw material considerations that we've got to address and think about at this stage?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, in principle, the transition to low carbon transport introduces a lot of changes in the technology that has direct implications on the material requirements. So, for our electric motors, we will need more rare earths. For our electric vehicles, we'll need a range of different elements such as lithium, cobalt, manganese, high-grade nickel, and graphite. Many of these materials are so-called critical raw materials because they are highly economically important, but they have serious supply risks and they operate under highly volatile markets. So in principle, to get the exponential increase in demand projected for these elements within the next decade or so, it's going to be very, very challenging. And it's not challenging because of physical availability issues. This is not an issue. We're not running out of any of these commodities, but it's an issue because it's quite difficult to bring supply to stream in such a short time scales. There are a lot of geopolitical, environmental, social, and governance challenges that we have to overcome, and these are need to be overlooked on a case-by-case situation. Not one commodity is the same as the other. The second issue is that the mining investment landscape is not very promising at the moment. If we are to bring new mining projects to stream, which we know we need to, we have to make sure that more investment goes into the mining sector. And lastly, what I would like to also highlight is that the decarbonisation targets that we've got in the UK are the same across the globe. Many other countries are having the same aspirations. So there's an element of extreme competing demands to secure supply for essential raw materials. And this is very significant and has already fired up debates on geopolitical status of materials for decarbonisation. We've seen trade restrictions, we've seen political conflicts, social issues, and so on and so forth. So the raw materials aspects regarding decarbonisation of transport should not be overlooked, and we really need to try to find tailored interventions to address the issue.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, isn't it? This blurring of the line that there is going to be. Emma, if I could put this to you, this blurring of the line between the energy sector, which we've thought of as being completely separate, and the automotive sector, and actually the coming together of them.
Yeah, and that's the nature of decarbonisation, right? And which, at least for heat and for transport and for power in the UK, will be heavily electrified, if not entirely electrified. And that means that the lines between those sectors of the economy are increasingly blurred. And to give you an example, in Germany, for example, VW have set up an energy supply business. In my world, the energy suppliers in the UK are looking at ways to help customers access EVs in the future. They're installing smart meters, smart chargers. They're offering time of use tariffs to enable people to charge their vehicles at different times of day. And some of them are offering vehicle to grid service, which is this idea of using cars as tiny portable batteries. And so from a system point of view, the electrification of transport is really about this wider transformation of the economy, and certainly means that we need to think about the mobility, power, and even heat very, very differently. And I would contend that how consumers think about these technologies, as with all the products in their homes, will also change as we move forward.
How much progress are we actually making, Baroness Brown? Because it was interesting listening to Mike Hawes right at the beginning. It was pretty blunt, I thought, and then to the Transport Secretary, and lots of kind of promises of things that are around the corner, things that are about to happen, but real questions about how we get to where you all think we need to be. How much more is there still to achieve, and to achieve in quite short order?
Well, of course, we've now got this target in the UK, so that all our new light-duty vehicles should be non-fossil fueled by between 2030 and 2035. So, as you say, it is in quite short order. We've got 10 years. We've got to get the infrastructure in place to give people the confidence that they will be able to charge their vehicles. We've got to continue with supporting the upfront cost of new vehicles, I think, for some time, because although we're very close to the through-life cost now being cheaper than for a fossil-fueled vehicle, that's not what consumers tend to see when they're buying a car. And we really have got to get the support for our manufacturers, and particularly focus on getting in place battery manufacturer at a large scale, the so-called gigafactories in the UK, because our car industry does need that support.
Yeah. So, besides the choice of technology, Isbrand, what needs to happen in order for us to get to that goal of net zero, in your view?
Well, I think the Baroness just mentioned that about the infrastructure. I think the development of the charging infrastructure, the power infrastructure, without which the capability and the goal of reaching net zero will be very severely hampered. I think UK right now has a massive opportunity in working towards that goal, but also challenges as well. We have been working with our partners in Scotland, Alexander Dennis, addressing some of these issues right now. We're also working with, for example, energy supplier, SSE, and also Leeds University to work on vehicle-to-grid programs. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. I think we've got a lot of exploration to continue.
Let's turn then to what has to be done for consumers, for operators to adopt those vehicles. Lady Brown was saying it's not immediately obvious to consumers why they should. And we were hearing as well earlier on in the programme, actually it was a question posed, wasn't it, by Grant Shapps, that business of getting people interested to the extent that they actually commit. Neville, it's one for you, I suppose. Even when someone doesn't see an immediate benefit, how do you persuade them that this is the way to go?
Well, that's probably the biggest challenge. I think persuading all consumers that this is the right approach is probably the biggest challenge of them all. And we also know that there is a certain resistance by an element of consumers to make changes. So I think from my perspective, it's more important to focus on this transition. How do we get there? Than perhaps the end goal. And what are the incremental steps we need to actually encourage more consumers to take this approach? What are the barriers? How do we address those barriers? And we know what they are already. It's cost, range, and recharging availability. And the Baroness pointed that out earlier. We've got to address all of those if we want to persuade enough consumers that actually make a difference. I think the other challenge here is maybe we're putting too many eggs in one basket, that maybe trying to accelerate the rollout of electric vehicles in such a short time is a bit risky. Maybe we should have other eggs in the basket that address bringing down the intensity of carbon emissions from transport by other means as well. And I'd like to see more work in actually driving the existing vehicle park down if we possibly can. So I think we need an array of options that are consumer friendly, that address consumer issues, and we avoid this big issue that we studied in the RAC Foundation, which is about transport poverty as well, because we need transport for all.
Lady Brown, what would you say to that?
I think Neville is absolutely right that we need transport for all. We need to be looking very hard as well at this as our public transport, because the ideal solution from reaching net zero is that we reduce the number of individuals driving alone in single cars on our roads. So better public transport. We need to be looking for people with transport poverty in, for example, in rural or village locations with little public transport, at electric on-demand buses and things like that. Not just thinking it's all about cars for individuals. And of course, things to encourage more car sharing is also an important element of the future, I think.
From a material supply point of view, Evie, how quickly, realistically, is it going to be possible to scale up to the extent that scale up is needed? What are the constraining factors? How quickly do you think it can be done?
Our gigafactories will need materials to run. So we need to make sure that somehow we have secure supply to the materials we need. And as I said, many of them are deemed as critical at the moment. I think the key question we're trying to answer at the moment is how can we ensure secure supply of these materials in the quantities and qualities we need them at the right time and being produced in a sustainable and responsible manner. And that's a very complicated question from at least the sector I'm coming and I'm representing. Bringing new supply to stream within such a short time scale and ensuring that there are no trade-offs between the different life cycle stages is very challenging. Just to understand a little bit properly what that entails, I'll give you a few examples. So, for instance, the average lifetime for a discovery of a new project, right, is between 8 to 11 years. And that's normally followed by mine development, which can take an average lifetime of 5 to 12 years. We're talking about 2 decades of preparatory work before you even start thinking about refining, producing your cathodes, producing your cells and your battery packs, and then your electric vehicles. And there are multiple factors that can influence the projection of the project, including investment, commodity markets, licensing, legislation, the social license to operate, etc., etc. And above all, we also want to ensure that sustainable and responsible production is the key. So our understanding of the environmental challenges associated with the different range of projects, the data we've got, the policy frameworks, and the connectivity between different important stakeholder groups at the moment is lacking behind. There are serious important issues around social participation and decision-making in new mining projects, which is very sensitive. It's a very important subject, which is often left at the local level, the nations that are producing these commodities, but their impacts can be global. So all in all, just to sum up, I think the likelihood of bringing new production to stream in the next 10 years, when we project the peak demand, doesn't look very positive. There are ways to move forward, but we'll have to find a way of interesting and smart interventions. And most importantly, we need to make sure that supply chain converges across the whole life cycle.
It's such an interesting question, because I think from the point of view of someone like me, who is not an expert in this, an onlooker from the outside, it would be something that we would understand would be almost obvious, is that when there is a demand for something, it will be supplied. And there is obviously going to be a demand for all sorts of materials. And we would assume then that the supply, that the investment in mining, for instance, just comes. But you were saying very plainly earlier on, Evie, that there is a problem with investment, with getting people to invest in this industry at the moment, or the various industries that are necessary.
Yes, this is very true. The issues are many and complex. Investment is definitely one issue, but there are a lot of environmental, social, and governance issues that they can also stop a project at any time. And we've seen this happening again and again. The case about critical raw materials is even more complex because many of these materials, as I said, we produce them in very small quantities. We produce billions of tons of iron ore. So for someone to invest in an iron ore project makes a lot of sense because it will make a lot of money out of that. When you're trying to produce a few 100,000 tons of a commodity such as lithium, or even a few tons of commodities such as uranium that we need like in an aerospace sector, right? There isn't a lot of incentive for the investment community to actually put money against a mining project such as that. And just because you're producing less doesn't mean that the risk associated with such a project is smaller. The risks are more or less the same, and it will take the same amount of time. And so far, unfortunately, we haven't seen many countries that they have big aspirations for electrifying transport to actually invest in mining projects or having some sort of joint ventures or long offtake agreements, etc., the kind of things we need to make sure that the gigafactories we're going to build, they're going to have the supply of materials they need in place.
It's fascinating. It's a bit like the pharmaceutical industry, really, isn't it? Getting investment into the right place, and it doesn't always happen in the way that people think it will. I want to turn to you, Emma, if I may. You said in your video, and I wrote it down, it was fascinating. You made the point that you were very confident that energy supply would be zero carbon and zero carbon pretty soon. What makes you so certain?
History, and actually, the technology availability, and this speaks to Evie's point and to Neville's as well. This is no longer a brand new idea. We have decarbonised a sector of the economy. We invested in a technology that felt extremely unlikely, 20 years ago in onshore and offshore wind and solar, and those technologies came on stream much faster than anyone predicted because we had clear targets from governments, which then built the supply chains and the kind of rules of operation that Evie's talking about needing to speed up the market. And consumers have then changed around that. So we know from the power sector that we can do this in other areas of the economy. The pace of change in the power sector now is such that it's a kind of unstoppable force, and it's not a conversation about targets driving the activity. It's simply better technologies and where the industry can see its future potential is in the continued rollout of clean technologies with or without decarbonisation commitments. That will happen in transport too. On the complexity of transport this isn't just big kit on the end of the system. It is going to involve consumer uptake. But just on Neville's point, if anyone here has driven an electric vehicle, I'm not even a car owner, and I've driven an EV and I love them. And they are, the Top Gear presenters love them, petrol heads love them. We shouldn't forget that they're an actually attractive consumer product that people really like. And I would be willing to bet my not inextensive shoe collection that consumers will want EVs and will be happy to drive them. The barriers are all about the system infrastructure, so making sure that we've got charging in the right place, making sure, as Evie says, we've got the right supply chains globally, and that is in the hands of national governments, networks, and the energy industry to facilitate. And just lastly, on the point about access to all, we do need to think about this as a whole system. As Baroness Brown has said, this is as much about thinking about the future of mobility and whether or not people will be in individual vehicles, whether they'll be doing car sharing, whether they'll be using public transport, and so on. And then on top of that, making sure that we find out where there are gaps, and that is where we should be applying policy. So on charging, for example, making sure that we do the bits that the industry will not do because they're less commercially attractive, or because the investment case isn't as clear, and that's where government should be focusing attention. But on the economics and the consumer proposition alone, I am so not worried about the decarbonisation of transport or the decarbonisation of power versus, say, the decarbonisation of heat or much more complex areas of the economy. It looks to be fairly unstoppable if we get the policy mechanisms right.
But Emma, on that point that you make about needing the infrastructure to be there. I mean, it was really interesting listening to Mike Hawes and then to Grant Shapps, and I'm not sure they were entirely on the same page when it comes to, I don't, again, from an observer from the outside, I'm not quite sure how we get to that. Do you kind of see these things coming clear to you of how we actually, and I know the government, well, Grant Shapps said, didn't he? I know the government's got things that it needs to announce and is going to be announcing in the coming months. But is it clear to you that the right things, in your view, are being thought about by those who need to think about them?
So they're being thought about for sure. The question is implementation. So we're looking to that low carbon transport strategy. We're looking to the government to enact the proposals it put forward in the energy white paper, and then the detail of actually energy markets will often be the thing that gets this done. So it's my world in some ways, not the world of SMMT. We need energy market design that means we can build these really interesting consumer-based propositions for things like getting people to charge their car at different times of day. We need our electricity system to be very flexible so we can deal with increased electricity demand, and that's all energy market design. We need the networks to have clear price signals so that they're encouraged to invest, and we need our network charging, which is not something I expect you to want to be interested in the detail of, to be right for the same reason, because that's the stuff that gets the infrastructure built. I guess the proof is in the pudding. The government is putting forward a lot of strategies this year. Your question was, do we know what the answers are? I think, yeah, actually, we're just waiting to see it turn into decent policy. And just to plug the work of the Committee on Climate Change and for Baroness Isbrand, that it has been very well mapped in terms of what we need to do to meet the net zero target and the kinds of policy instruments that government might want to bring forward. Yeah. And just very lastly, no government sets a target for a sector unless they're pretty confident they can get there. So I think it's not a case of thinking, it's doing.
Yeah, I suppose so, unless that government doesn't expect to be around when the date is reached. But anyway, I take your point. Let's have some questions. We've got lots of come in from the many people who are watching you all. The first one for you, Baroness Brown, and it's about the credibility of the UK's reputation in advance of COP26. And this question, which comes from Alan Thomas at CAVT Limited, is that credibility at risk if we're only considering the UK internal impact of the electrification of transport on climate change, while increasing potentially demand for imported materials that embed other countries' CO2? What do you make of that? Lady Brown, you're muted again.
Sorry.
No,
yes, right. I don't think that's an issue in terms of our reputation, because the whole purpose of the approach at the COP and the way the Paris Agreement is set up is that we are all making commitments to reduce our emissions. So, China has made a commitment to be at net zero by 2060. We've had the Americans come back into the Paris Agreement and the COP process. So the whole purpose of doing it as an international community is that we're all reducing our emissions at roughly the same kind of pace. I mean, appropriate for the richest countries with the largest historic impact to be reducing faster than some of the lower and mid-income companies, but that we're all doing this together. So I think it is really crucial that the government supports industry in the UK in order to try not to export our emissions. But I think the international agreement is that we're all in this together and we all need to reduce our emissions together. So I don't think that is an issue, but I do think we need to make sure that, for example, we're supporting our steel industry to decarbonise when its prices might be then a bit higher than other places that are going more slowly down the path. So, that's crucial areas for government policy.
OK, Isbrand, if I could put this to you. It's from Sarah Sochi from Volkswagen Group UK. Zero tailpipe emissions definitely key, but what about the whole life cycle of the vehicle, from manufacturing process to disposal of the redundant battery? Also, obviously, all things that are going to have an impact on the environment. To what extent is the whole life cycle properly being considered, she asks?
Well, funny that he asked that question, because I was just in Wolfsburg last year talking to Dr. Dees about this particular question. And all things considered, if you look at the current ICE, internal combustion engine vehicles, from the well to the wheels, it's not only about the vehicle itself, it's also about getting the oil out from the ground and to the processing plant, to the transportation, to the vehicle that's carrying these petroleums to the gas pumps. So if you look at the whole ecosystem together and you compare that to the electric vehicles, and I've seen some numbers before, and do not quote me on that, I think it's only about 1/3 of that of the conventional ICE equivalent. So I think that's all been considered. And we've done some internal studying to making sure that these numbers are legitimate. And all things considered, if you look at the ICE engines today, and if you look at what the commitments, the powerhouses like a Mercedes and Audi, they have made in the last couple of days, that the development of ICE is coming to an end. So we can pretty much assure the fact that we will not be seeing any additional development in ICE. And coming to the point about the whole life, with the battery electric vehicles, a large portion of that vehicle, and thanks to REACH, that the vehicle itself, it's recyclable, and so are the batteries. So I think if you take the whole scheme of things together, I think the electric solution is a much better solution than the conventional ICE solution.
It's an interesting point about the batteries, because again, I think it's something that people, and possibly a piece of communication that needs to be done with the public generally. You're saying there is no question the batteries, there's not going to be a kind of dump somewhere with a lot of batteries in it one day that we say, well, there was nothing else we could do with them. Those things are being not just talked about and thought about, but actually have been addressed. Is that right, Isbrand?
Let me answer that question, okay? We have today a capacity about 60 gigawatt hour per year of battery production. And this last year, we have been very successful in redeploying these batteries. About 1.2 gigawatts of these batteries are being repurposed and also redeployed. We are looking at the end of life of these batteries right now. And what we are using right now in the industrial recognized term called echelon use. And basically, we are cascading it down from the vehicle itself to storage. And then at the very end of the EOL, end of life, they are disassembled. They are recovered from the anode to the cathode. All the materials can be recovered, as well as the piece parts. So at the end of the day, we're looking at a very, very little loss of that material. So it is a captive environment. It is a captive process.
Yeah, OK. Another question, actually, we'll stick with you if I can, because there's another one that I think is obviously really one for you, Isbrand. This was from Tim Hicks, who works at Isuzu Truck UK, who says, yeah, we've talked about heavier vehicles and batteries being the solution for final mile deliveries, but what is your thought about heavier vehicles on proper long-haul missions? How realistic are zero tailpipe solutions for them?
That's a fantastic question, because battery is weight, isn't it? So how much weight do you carry compared to how much goods you're carrying in that lorry? So it's always debatable. We've come up with different solutions. For example, swappable batteries. These trucks, the long-haul lorries, they need to stop somewhere. And when they stop, they can program these stops to have the battery lifted out and new one replaced. We've been talking to a few energy companies about actually deploying these programs. So for the long-haul purpose right now, I would say at least 3 to 5 years down the road. But for the last mile solution within London, within Nottinghamshire, that is very deployable at this moment.
OK, fascinating. Let's go on to another question. Jack Hunsley from Automotive World asks about hydrogen. I think this is probably for you, Neville, at least to kick us off. Is it a useful transitionary technology, he asks, and will hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, particularly in the CV sector, stack up to be EVs?
In my view, the answer is yes. I think we're going to need to see hydrogen roll out in some quantity, particularly for the long-distance heavy-duty applications. It's difficult to see how we can manage all applications with just batteries. I'm sure some of them will, but in some applications, hydrogen seems to make a lot more sense, and you'll hear that view from many of the heavy-duty vehicle manufacturers. There may be other solutions as well, but at the moment, many of them are pursuing the hydrogen route as one of the practical ones to follow. There are issues around how we generate hydrogen, whether it is efficient or not, and there are also issues about the supply network that you will need. Having said that, we need to look at not just what vehicles we use, but how the energy system responds. Originally, most sectors operated independently with their energy supply. In the future, it's much more of a complex system. Emma spoke about heat and the challenge of decarbonising heat. I think in automotive, we say effectively that transport is only the first course, heat is the main course in how we might address defossilisation. If we roll out hydrogen, for instance, in some ways for heat, it becomes probably more available for transport. So we have to take that system view. There are challenges with building fuel cell vehicles. There are cost issues, supply issues, but I think you'll find in the battle between battery electric and hydrogen, we're probably still in that race. The race has not been won yet, and we need to invest to find out which is the best way for whichever application.
Neville, what about other technologies? We've had a question from Patrick Keating at Honda. What about plug-in hybrids? Where do you put the kind of range of technologies that are potentially still in the mix, as it were?
So, I mean, it does depend who you speak to, but my own personal view is the majority of vehicles, passenger car vehicles, can probably go battery electric. But as you get to longer distance and heavier duty applications, you probably need to look at other solutions as well, whether that's hydrogen or whether that's synthetic fuels or biogas or other materials and other fuels. We can debate, but I think we need to look at more solutions in order to achieve our net zero goal. Just relying on one technology, I think, is highly risky. We need to do more, and we need to look at more options, and we need to push those much harder, because unless we look at all those options, we're not going to achieve our targets, which is the greatest concern, I think, for most of us. Meeting our 2035, 2040 and 2050 goals are absolutely critical, and we can't afford to miss them because we've just put too many eggs in one basket.
Emma, what's your view of that, of the range that we should have available and indeed be pursuing?
So the system point is the right one. So I should say Energy UK is technology neutral. So with the exception that we want to see net zero done, and I've spent my career working on decarbonisation. So you can take that from me that the energy sector is serious about it. I think if you look at the whole system, one of the reasons we actually talk about electrification of transport isn't just that it seems like the most sensible consumer proposition, or indeed that it works with the wider electricity system. It's that hydrogen is clearly going to be a valuable commodity in the economy as a whole, and we're probably going to need it to use it in the bits of the economy that we have no other solutions for. If you're talking about completely transforming the economy by 2050, you do need to not just use a mix of technologies, but use them in the right applications. So we're pretty sure that it will be largely electrification of transport. And I mean, really mostly electrification of transport, because we can see the consumer proposition and we can see the system advantage of it, but also that we think that hydrogen will have to be used where we don't have as many alternatives. I agree with Neville that if you're starting from the bottom up with technology development, of course it makes sense to have hydrogen in multiple areas of the economy, but the reality from an infrastructure point of view and the way we think decarbonisation will have to happen is with a constrained and valuable resource, you use it where you have to, and you can just see excuse the pun, the roadmap for electrifying transport. I think by 2030, this won't be a conversation we're happening. And the last thing I'd say is I've been here before. I was here 10 years ago when we were talking about the potential for large-scale renewables in power, and this feels very much like a similar conversation. I would bet my life on EVs in the same way I did on wind turbines in the UK, and see where we are in 10 years' time.
Okay, well, talking of 10 years' time, this is another question that I think really is for you, Emma. It's from Sophie Peachy at Lotix, and it's about the energy sector's future and whether or not power can be put in the hands of the citizen by sharing data. So she asks, will the industry, will the sector consider a data mesh approach so that data about charge point infrastructure, vehicle power needs, electricity distribution, all this stuff can actually be available so that it will all be kind of there and monitored and organised in the EV sort of ecosystem?
So yes and no, and not out of any conspiracy about wanting to keep consumer data to ourselves, but actually just because of how we want to use data in the system. The first thing to say is absolutely the right thing to ask about. Data is going to be as valuable a commodity in the energy sector as something like oil is now. And our data sets are terrible, where they are very siloed. We don't necessarily share them, and they're held in all different bits of the economy. So, for example, just think about the government departments involved in this. It's in the future energy system, it won't just be the Department for Energy that's involved. We also need DFT and grant apps and data about electric vehicles. We need to understand where consumers are and how they're using heat in their homes and who's fuel poor and all of that stuff. And it's all in different parts of government and different bits of society. So there's a big project going on called the Energy Data Task Force, where we've looked at energy data sets and setups and protocols, things like assuming all data is open. And we're trying to do work on making sure that the quality of our data and how it's shared is also more homogenous across the sector. In terms of consumers, we're already doing some of that. So everyone should be getting a smart meter in their home. And there are already suppliers offering things like agile tariffs and apps where you can have a relationship with how your EV is charged. My challenge back to you is not every consumer will want to do that. A lot of them will just want it to happen and for it to be automated. The important thing is the service you get on the other end and feeling sure that your supplier is offering you the best that they can with the data available. So I think it's questionable about whether every customer will want access to the data. But of course, if they do, there are suppliers already working on giving them that model. Consumers like my mum that just want their washing machine to go on when it's cheapest will want that automated and will want that relationship to be done with, by their supplier and their supplier to have that data. But certainly, is data valuable? Yeah, absolutely. And I would love to work more closely with SMMT on getting that right across the economy. Yeah.
Very interesting. A follow-up question, I think, really for you, Neville, from Simon Jones at Squire Patton Boggs, UK. We're talking about all the various alternatives that people might want to keep in mind. This is one I'd certainly never heard of, but the idea of a synthetic petrol. Porsche apparently made an announcement about this recently. So this is something usable in existing vehicles and potentially, I suppose, heavy vehicles as well. So Simon's question or point is just that maybe that should be included among these various range of things that are being considered. Is that right, Neville? Would you?
It's certainly an option that many are looking at present. The real challenge we have with synthetic fuels is the efficiency of production and the cost. It's obviously one of the few realistic options we have for aviation, for instance. So how do we produce a zero carbon fuel that's energy dense that we can use in specific applications? I think we should continue to explore that option. I think we will continue to explore it for aviation, and they maybe read across to certain road transport or surface transport applications. But at the moment, we have a lot of work to do if we want to make that affordable in the mass market. The introduction of such fuels is also a challenge. In aviation, it has probably the biggest challenge because there is no tax on aviation fuel. With various tax policies, it might be feasible to introduce it into surface transport as a drop-in fuel to make it compatible with existing vehicles, for instance, but the supply quantities will always be limited. I think it makes much more sense, for instance, if you were to supply that synthetic fuel to a plug-in hybrid for some applications. So I think the challenge is all about the economics, as we all know, in the real world, economics rules. And we've got to find an economically viable route to get those fuels to market. But I would certainly pursue that option for certain applications.
Final question also to you. It's a wider one, Neville. Comes from Robert O'Neill from the Welsh Automotive Forum, who's CEO of it. From the information shared this morning, he says it appears the UK is sadly behind the European automotive powerhouses in relation to the three I's, incentives and infrastructure, two of those I's in particular. Why and what do we do about it?
Wow. I'm not necessarily sure I'm the right person to answer that. I think we have great potential in the UK. We're very good at working together. The automotive community is very good at working together. I think we have the potential to offer perhaps the most sustainable, the best batteries in the world with the most environmentally responsible solutions. We're certainly going to have to make our own batteries by 2026 due to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which I'm sure will be discussed later with Europe. So we also have an absolutely outstanding academic sector, and what we're doing with the Faraday Initiative in developing new battery technology is second to none. So I think we have certain things in our favour. What we need to do perhaps a little better is for the industry, academia and government to work more closely together and listen to each other about what each other's challenges are, so we can come up with what I think might be more workable solutions, particularly in this transition. Unless we do that, I think we will fall behind. Our competitors in Europe have announced much larger investment plans than we have so far. I think we're going to have to catch up. But I think it's within our power to really be a leading light in this if we get our act together.
Right, a suitable note of challenge and optimism on which to leave. Thank you all so hugely, everyone who's taken part, and also all of you for asking questions as well.